Hello and welcome to this video lecture series that I've put together for human sexuality and Christian ethics here at AMBS. This video is part of the Developing Definitions series that accompanies the first several weeks of the semester. And in particular, we're going to be focusing in on the wellness wheel in this installment of the series. I'm recording this video here at home and my cat is sitting on my lap, so we'll see how this goes. Before we get into the meat of the video, I want to apprise you of the fair use notice that governs the video series. This video and the rest in the series all contain content that's protected by copyright. Unless otherwise noted, that content appears here in a manner that's protected by fair use guidelines as defined in Section 107 of the Copyright Act. So please respect the limitations of these guidelines. Do not distribute this course material beyond students enrolled in HTE 646, Human Sexuality and Christian Ethics. All right, to the wellness wheel. This is a tool that helps us think about our lives critically, truthfully, and non-violently. And as we go through the various domains or dimensions or spokes or areas of the wheel, I encourage you to have the handout that I've prepared and that was either distributed in class or is available for you to download electronically handy. Have that handy as we move through the material. On our way to the content for the lecture, I want to just share with you a few goals that I have for the lecture. First, I want to introduce the wellness wheel to you again as a tool for thinking peaceably about our personal lives and lifestyle choices. So in other words, by the end of the video, you should be able to answer the question, what's the wellness wheel and what does it have to do with this class? A second goal that I have for the lecture is to help contextualize our use of the word wellness, both in relationship to the wellness wheel, but also in the larger context of human sexuality and Christian ethics. A third goal is to link wellness to ethics. So again, by the end of the video, you should be able to start offering some explanation or share some ideas about how wellness relates to ethics. And fourth, one of the things that I will be doing in the video, in the lecture content, one of the ways I'll be approaching the subject matter, is to frame Christian thinking about sexual health theologically using Mennonite peace theology. Now, I'm not going to be doing that directly, or we might say explicitly in this video lecture. Rather, I'm going to be offering some framework, some foundational ideas that we'll build on over the course of the semester. But what I hope will happen for you is that you'll start to make some connections on your own, kind of intuitively, as I introduce some of the big ideas related to peace theology, wellness, and ethics. So let's turn now to an overview of the wellness wheel. So here's the wheel as it shows up on your handout. But before we get into each one of the spokes, I want to talk a little bit about the background and the origins of the concept of wellness. So we're going to start with the definition of wellness. This is, after all, a series on developing definitions. If you were to type in the word wellness in your internet browser, you might get a result that offers this kind of basic working definition, dictionary definition of the term. Wellness is the state of being in good health, especially as an actively pursued goal. If we go to Wikipedia, which, as I've noted on the handout, doesn't have simply one entry on wellness, but has a variety of entries on wellness, one of the places we can go is to understand or see that wellness is connected to alternative medicine. In this article in Wikipedia, the contributors say or describe wellness as a state beyond absence of illness, but wellness rather aims to optimize well-being. The term was partly inspired by the preamble to the World Health Organization's 1948 Constitution, which includes this sentence: "Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity." One rhetorical parallel I want to just point out to you between this view of wellness and sometimes how we think about or talk about peace. You may have heard people say peace isn't the absence of violence or the absence of war, but is the presence of justice. Well, similarly, so wellness isn't simply the state of being free from disease, but it is experiencing a kind of sense of being at peace, being satisfied, being free and at home in your own skin. If we keep going further, though, with a few of these definitions, Wikipedia also has an article on well-being, and the researchers who are quoted there define wellness as a concept that refers to diverse and interconnected dimensions of physical, mental, and social well-being that extend beyond the traditional definition of health. So wellness is more than health. Wellness includes choices and activities aimed at achieving physical vitality, mental alacrity, social satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment, and personal fulfillment. I hope as you hear this definition, you're starting to think about the different dimensions or spokes of the wellness wheel. I think it's also worth noting that Wikipedia, in this realm of wellness, links up the Greek term eudaimonia. Now, eudaimonia comes from ancient Greek, and it's a word that's often translated as happiness or welfare. It's also at the root of a lot of philosophical debate and discussion, both in the ancient world and our own. This idea from Robin Levin's definition of ethics, especially Christian ethics, that Christian thinking about what it is that everyone is seeking or what it means to live the good life or to be happy is one way this question of eudaimonia shows up in Christian ethics, right? But it's also, I think, important to understand that eudaimonia isn't just about being happy or feeling kind of fulfilled in oneself, but it can also be translated to describe human flourishing, what utilitarian or goal-oriented ethicists would describe as the common good, prosperity, and even a kind of sense or a state of blessedness, which again is linked up to this sense of well-being. So if we put the pieces together, we see that wellness is well-being. It's feeling satisfied and flourishing. So the word wellness describes a wholeness in many ways that is made up of parts represented by the wellness wheel, and these parts seem to have a kind of synergy to them. So we might say that the different dimensions of wellness, when we put them together, reflect a greater whole than just the sum of their parts. What the wheel can help us see is that as individuals or groups, we can be thriving in one area but ailing in another. So while wellness, when we are kind of at our peak, we can experience that as a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. The opposite is also true. We can be thriving in one area of our lives, but not thriving in another. So that when combined, our overall wellness is impacted by both the highs and the lows. Giving attention to the separate domains in the full wheel gives us the opportunity to assess our choices. Am I really doing well if I feel on fire spiritually, but stuck in a toxic job and work environment? These are the kinds of questions that are prompted by the wellness wheel. If you do another kind of internet search for wellness wheel template, you might find a document or a graphic or a website that can provide you with the wellness wheel in a worksheet format. This is one use of the wellness wheel that I want to be sure that you know about. We talk about the wellness wheel as a kind of general concept or as theory, but one of the ways that we can use it as a tool, either personally or with a group, is to invite people, or for our own, if we're using this for ourselves, to take time to sit down and ask ourselves, all right, in each of these different dimensions of my life, how do I feel like I'm doing on a scale from 1 to 10? 1 being not good at all, and 10 being completely, deeply satisfied and fulfilled. So the website that I pulled this off of provided this sample of a filled-in chart. And what you can see here is that when it comes to home and this person's kind of the environment in which they live and their mental health and their job satisfaction, they're doing pretty well in those areas. Relationships, so physical health is also an area of deep satisfaction. Finances, not too bad. Spirituality and recreation, that is free time and nurturing personal growth, are areas that are rated the lowest. So again, you can see that while some areas are places of flourishing and deep satisfaction, other areas not so much. And so one of the questions for reflection that can be prompted by a wellness wheel is, how might we increase a sense of satisfaction and wellness in some of these other areas, and to bring all of the dimensions of wellness into better balance? Well, to do that, I want to walk through the wheel, and we're going through the different dimensions here in alphabetical order, not in order of priority. So emotional wellness. This is text that's on the handout, and I just want to make sure that we go through it. Emotional wellness is the area concerned with feelings and emotions, obviously. So positive self-esteem and a capacity for empathy, both for self and others, are hallmarks of emotional wellness. How well can I understand myself and cope with the challenges that life brings would be a kind of reflection question prompted by this area of wellness. And I should say too that as I go through these areas, these dimensions, these spokes, I want you to be thinking about how sexuality and sexual ethics connect with these different areas, because you'll have seen that sexual wellness is not one of the dimensions on the wellness wheel. And that is in part because I would say that sexuality as part of our experience of embodiment is connected to all of these different dimensions. And so why pull that out as one area, right? So how does that part of our identity, of your identity, connect with these different areas of wellness? Environmental wellness is a domain that focuses on how humans interact with the natural world in contrast to the built environment generally. A reflection question might sound like this: how well can I recognize my responsibility for the quality of the environment around me and ecosystems I participate in? At the same time, some people focus in on this dimension of wellness as less about the natural world beyond the built environment, to include the built environment. So we're also going to be thinking about environment as the quality of spaces that we live in. And this kind of interplay between the built environment and the natural world I think is pretty important, especially when we think about relationships. I'm guessing that you've all probably heard of phrases like toxic masculinity or a toxic work environment or a toxic relationship. This is an example of where terminology from ecology makes its way into how we talk about human relationships, which also then connotes this sense of environmental wellness. Financial wellness. This dimension of wellness invites us to assess our capacity to live within our means by managing resources wisely. How well can I identify my relationship with money and assess my skills for reflecting on the mental, spiritual, and physical aspects of money? This might also include the gendered aspects of gender stereotypes we might have about how much money I should be earning, or dealing with the gender gap in pay. So financial wellness on the face of it doesn't seem to have to do much with sexuality and sexual ethics, but you might be surprised. Intellectual wellness. This spoke of the wheel highlights our critical thinking skills and whether we operate out of a fixed or growth mindset. How well can I open my mind to new ideas and experiences and apply insights I gain from these ideas and experiences to personal decision-making, group interactions, and community building? Occupational wellness. This area is concerned with the choices that go into determining how we contribute to larger society, especially or particularly in the form of paid work. How much personal fulfillment do I receive from my current job, career path, and sense of vocation, while keeping other aspects of wellness in balance? Physical wellness. This domain is focused on the options we have for taking care of our bodies to ensure we're listening to the physiological communications we participate in as embodied beings. In other words, are you listening to your body? How well can I maintain a healthy quality of life as I meet my needs for food, water, and exercise, or respond when my body is ill? Social wellness. This dimension of wellness involves our interpersonal skills for building relationships. How well can I connect with other people, appropriately navigate conflict, and participate in community? And then there's spiritual wellness. This spoke on the wheel directs our attention to the ways we find deep meaning in life and a sense of purpose. How well does my life reflect my values and beliefs, helping me establish peace and harmony in my life? So here we are with this overview of the wellness wheel, a tool for thinking about our lives critically, truthfully, and nonviolently. Let's get into this nonviolent piece by linking wellness to ethics. I want to start here by talking about peace theology and ethics. This is tied up with AMBS's history. AMBS is steeped in an intellectual project that has been the focus of Mennonite institutional life since World War II. World War II began in 1939 and the war came to an end in 1945. So we're talking about the second half of the 20th century on now into the present. This project is often referred to as peace theology, and its focus has been on making Christian pacifism intellectually respectable. So what we have to remember is that there was a time when Christian pacifism was neither intellectually nor socially nor politically respectable. In fact, to be a conscientious objector and to stand in opposition to military service was regarded by many people, not just in the United States, but in other places in the Western world especially, as morally reprehensible. Now, in the United States, cultural attitudes toward conscientious objection to war and military service changed significantly, especially in the 1960s, both with the civil rights movement and the way that movement was committed to nonviolence, but also in a lot of the student activism that galvanized opposition to the war that the United States was fighting in Vietnam. With that change on the horizon, other changes happened. That is, the conversation about violence and nonviolence changed to move from including talk about conscientious objection to war and military service to other broader areas. This is where we start getting into thinking about nonviolent social change, or the different dimensions of violence. That violence isn't just about physical harm, it's also about emotional harm, psychological harm, impacting other dimensions of the wellness wheel. Now, let me also just add here, as we move along now, from time to time, you'll see these little icons or images on the screen that come from the wellness wheel. These are intended to symbolize the different dimensions of the wheel that I think come into play with these different currents and big ideas. So that for many of the professors at AMBS, participating in making Christian pacifism intellectually respectable was one way they were finding great satisfaction in their occupations and intellectually too. To better understand what I was referring to by this kind of expanding notion of violence, let's start by defining violence. And again, we'll begin with a basic dictionary definition. Violence refers to behavior involving physical force that's intended to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something. Britannica.com agrees with this by beginning with the definition of violence as an act of physical force that causes or is intended to cause harm. But then they take it another step further and identify the damage that's inflicted by violence as possibly being not just physical, but psychological, or both. And then Britannica.com makes an interesting distinction or nuanced difference between violence and aggression. They say violence may be distinguished from aggression, a more general type of hostile behavior that may be physical, verbal, or passive in nature. The Westminster Dictionary of Theological Terms also includes an entry written by Donald McKim, includes an entry on violence. McKim writes, the use of various kinds of force that inflict harm on individuals or groups is the basic definition of violence. But then he goes on to add, violence is a social ethical issue and raises questions of whether or not the use of violence can ever be morally justifiable from a Christian perspective. So what we see in this survey here is that there is a consensus around the use of physical force that's intended to hurt or harm another person or thing. So there's a physical dimension to this. But the Britannica.com definition adds an emotional dimension, and the Westminster Dictionary adds a spiritual dimension to it. Well, we know what violence is. What about nonviolence? Well, nonviolence can be defined as the use of peaceful means, not force, to bring about political or social change. Wikipedia takes a slightly different tack in defining nonviolence. Nonviolence is the personal practice of being harmless to oneself and others under every condition. Nonviolence may come from the belief that hurting people, animals, and/or the environment is unnecessary to achieve an outcome, and it may refer to a general philosophy of abstention from violence. Nonviolent communication, which is an approach to nonviolent social change that comes out of the Gandhian tradition of nonviolence, views nonviolence similar to the Wikipedia entry. Nonviolence is our natural state of compassion when violence has subsided from the heart, Marshall Rosenberg writes in his book. So we can see here that the basic dictionary definition of nonviolence emphasizes what I would call a social dimension of life, whereas Wikipedia and nonviolent communication are drawing attention to environmental wellness, spiritual wellness, and emotional wellness. I want to add another layer here, though. We often use the word nonviolence and pacifism interchangeably, but it might be useful to spend a little bit of time with each of the terms to see how they're similar and also different. The basic dictionary definition of pacifism is the belief that any violence, including war, is unjustifiable under any circumstances, and that all disputes should be settled by peaceful means. Wikipedia generally concurs, saying that pacifism is opposition to war, militarism, or violence. The entry in Wikipedia explains where the word comes from. It was coined by the French peace campaigner Émile Arnaud and adopted by other peace activists at the 10th Universal Peace Congress in Glasgow, Scotland, back in 1901. So it's a relatively new word when we think about the length of human history, but we also see that that's a powerful word in the 20th century. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has an entry on pacifism, and the writers who contributed to that article point out that yes, pacifism is a commitment to peace and opposition to war. At the same time, our ordinary language allows a diverse set of beliefs and commitments to be held together under the general rubric of pacifism. So this is getting at that kind of expanded tent or umbrella of what constitutes a concern related to violence, as the term violence itself has also sort of expanded and become more complex and inclusive of different things. Another thing, though, from the Stanford Encyclopedia that's worth noting is that pacifism has often been defined dialectically in relation to the idea of justified violence that is found in the Western just war tradition. And going back to AMBS's project around peace theology, this is certainly true. The people who professors at AMBS were kind of arguing with were folks who would be advocates for or defend a just war point of view within the ecumenical Christian body. So that making pacifism intellectually respectable from a cultural perspective was one of the dynamics, but then also within the academy, saying that this makes sense. This is a justifiable, logical conclusion to draw from faithful interpretation of Scripture, right? And so challenging long-held traditions within the Western Christian Church of the possibility of a just war. So it's in this context that I also want to say a word about AMBS's hermeneutical tradition. The Institute of Mennonite Studies is the research wing of AMBS and has, ever since the 1970s, published books, journals, and held conferences focused around a whole host of issues that are important to Mennonite church life, but also has worked, part of the agenda of IMS is to help kind of push out and keep this peace theology project going. So who you see pictured here includes C.J. Dick, who was the founding director of IMS. He was a church history professor here, C.J. of blessed memory. And then Jamie Pitts is the current director. Between CJ and Jamie, though, Willard Swartley, who's pictured here in the red fleece vest, and then to standing next to him in the green turtleneck is Mary Schertz. They were, Willard was CJ's immediate successor, and then Mary was Willard's successor as director of Institute of Mennonite Studies. And they were joined by Barb Nelson Gingrich and as managing editor, and now David Kramer. And you can see in front of them a sampling of the kinds of publications that IMS creates and produces that include a series of books that engage in biblical peace theology. So a couple of the covers of these books are shown here. Perry Yoder, Willard Swartley, and Mary Schertz being prominent among the contributors to this book series. Perry taught Old Testament at the seminary. Willard, also of blessed memory, taught New Testament, and then Mary Schertz, most recently retired, also taught in the area of New Testament. And so first, these wonderful people were my teachers, but again, what I'm trying to paint a picture of here is how much this peace theology project has really shaped not only the content of theological education at AMBS, but the ethos of the seminary. Perry's book, Shalom, the Bible's Word for Salvation, Justice, and Peace, that you see pictured here, when I was a student 20 years ago, was assigned at least 3, 4, if not 5 times in my classes in the Peace Studies program. I'm not sure if it's how many reading lists it's on now, course bibliographies it's on now, but it certainly shapes my own teaching, even if I don't assign it to you to read. So you can see, again, based on some of these titles here, which come out of some of the, are part of the IMS book series, that thinking about violence, peacemaking, peace building, biblical hermeneutics, and biblical theology in relationship to the mission of the church and understanding the reign of God, understanding shalom as being a biblical principle that shows up in both testaments of the Bible. These are all part of AMBS's hermeneutical tradition. And so now I want to turn to a definition of shalom before bringing into focus some of Perry Yoder's work especially. So if you look up shalom in the dictionary, you'll see that shalom is used as a salutation by Jewish people at meeting or parting. It means peace. Wikipedia explains, yes, shalom is a Hebrew word meaning peace, harmony, wholeness, prosperity, completeness, welfare, and tranquility. It can also be used idiomatically to mean both hello and goodbye. That goes back to this basic dictionary definition. But then Wikipedia also points out that shalom can refer to either peace between two entities or to the well-being, welfare, or safety of an individual or a group of individuals. Okay, so on the one level, or at first glance, shalom can be simply translated as peace, but it means more than just peace. It's kind of like wellness in that way, right? Wellness isn't just about being healthy, but it's this more full-orbed sense of wholeness and being at peace. If you look up shalom in the Westminster Dictionary of Theological Terms, Donald McKim directs you to the entry on peace, where peace is defined as fullness, well-being. He adds that peace is a Hebrew term used for both greeting and farewell, with great richness of meaning. It is much more than lack of war and points to full societal and personal well-being, coupled with righteousness and possible only as a gift of God. Okay. Now, as you hear all of this, I hope that you're thinking the wellness wheel, right? That there is a fairly clear link between the word shalom and the concept of wellness. But let's keep taking this a little bit deeper. So I want to offer now a kind of biblical understanding of shalom, and this grows out of Perry Yoder's work and his book, Shalom, the Bible's Word for Salvation, Justice, and Peace. The first point that Perry makes, which is also reflected in Donald McKim's entry on the word peace, is that there's a continuity of usage between the Greek word eirene and the Hebrew shalom, from the Hebrew Bible to the Christian Testament and then the Septuagint, which is, of course, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Now, Perry's reading of Shalom is what I would call an Anabaptist liberationist reading. He says that Shalom is God's word for salvation, justice, and peace. So that he's saying it's not just about peace, right? It's actually about salvation and justice. These things are intermingled. Shalom, thus, isn't the opposite of violence, right? Like we think of war and peace as being opposites. Shalom is, in fact, the opposite of injustice. It is injustice that gives rise to violence, and violence that stands in the way of shalom. I think this is an interesting and important note. Perry goes on to say that shalom is a canonical biblical principle. It is the center of everything. Again, if we're defining shalom as salvation, justice, and peace, then it's very easy to understand how shalom is the center of everything. And indeed, I think this is a huge part of, again, kind of the approach to theological education that we take at AMBS. Where some people, or often there's a debate between maybe folks who are who would I describe themselves as more evangelical leaning, saying, no, Jesus is the center of the gospel. And those who are maybe more social justice activist oriented want to say, no, peace is the center of the gospel. What AMBS says is that it is both. Jesus is shalom, and shalom is Jesus. That God's shalom is what Jesus is manifesting, and that you cannot understand the good news without understanding shalom. So this is what this statement, this pearl point means. Shalom is a canonical biblical principle that's the center of everything. Perry writes, in the Bible, shalom is a vision of what ought to be and a call to transform society. As he continues to work at his understanding and his biblical theology of shalom, Perry identifies shalom as having four aspects. The first is that, and so these are ways that the term is used in the biblical text. One dimension or aspect of shalom has to do with material well-being and economic prosperity. If one is experiencing shalom, then their material needs are satisfied. We might talk about that as financial wellness, right? But shalom also refers to a quality of social relationships. These social relationships include everything from interactions between neighbors, so the interpersonal, to relations between nations. So it gets into international relations. Is there shalom between the United States and Canada? But another part of this quality of social relationships involves a feeling of God working to end suffering and oppression. So that, yes, if there is shalom at work or evidenced in these various interactions between nations or neighbors, one kind of sign that there is shalom is that we see that that the Holy Spirit, is how I'll name that, seems to be present, and people are working together to end suffering and oppression. Shalom also has to do with the moral and ethical dimensions of our lives. A person of shalom acts with integrity, speaks straightforwardly, and experiences the peace of God. So this again, think about the knowing, being, doing, theological integration triad, right? The being experience corresponds with experiencing the peace of God. Speaking straightforwardly perhaps is the kind of cognitive domain, the knowing, and acting with integrity, the doing domain. And fourth, there's an understanding of Jesus' atonement, his going to the cross, as well. His death is transformative, and it's transformative because he is going to the cross as a peaceful warrior, to use some of Mary Schertz's language from her commentary on the Gospel of Luke. That Jesus understands himself to be fighting against violence, but not using the same tools and strategies as violence, but instead choosing to fight peacefully, right? To fight for justice, according to the principles of Shalom, right? Speaking straightforwardly, acting with integrity, and experiencing the peace of God. So again, I hope that as you hear these things, you're both making your own kind of intuitive connections with the wellness wheel, but then also an ethics, but then also starting to link this up with our more particular agenda as it relates to human sexuality. In closing, I want to say I hope that this video lecture helps you understand what the wellness wheel is, and I hope it also helps you begin to intuit how sexuality is connected to well-being. I also hope that you're able to link God's concern for our shalom with our need to develop deliberate body theology that supports our sexual ethics. And I also hope that this video lecture is helping you understand how AMBS's history of developing Shalom hermeneutics is connected to our approach to developing criteria for healthy sexuality that's resonant with the good news of God's Shalom. Thanks for tuning in, and look for more videos in this series online.